I've gone over the paper many times, and the more I go over it, the more I wonder if I'm the right person to respond to it. What we've seen in this presentation of the Italian, the translation, the technology, is a perfect example of what I talked about yesterday, the interanimation of languages through cultural transmission. I have 4 or 5 points that I want to make, and then there will be time for discussion. The part that I want to concentrate on is that where Professor Vacca says, in prison notebooks, Gramsci's language changes. He does not speak anymore, as in the 1920s, of death of the state, but he speaks of crisis of the state. The crisis of the crisis, in other words. A term which he does not employ only in relation to the exercise of sovereignty. He is certainly very attentive to the new limitations of sovereignty. Sovereignty, legal representation of violence, sacred violence, as Benjamin points out, and the nature of the sovereign state is then on the agenda. And I'm going to make a few comments about that in relationship to Germany, which is more familiar to me than Italy. He considered, continuing your words, he considers particularly negative, for example, treaties, but he does not place the strength of the state. Is this mine, Alessandra?
Yes, that is it.
He does not place the strength of the state in a territorial sovereignty that is assumedly absolute. Instead, he places such strength in the ability to open up supranationality. This is not in a messianic, apocalyptic mode of supra-transcendent nationality, but here we get into a real crux of the whole problem, I think. Before analyzing the solutions, it is worthwhile to dwell on the vision of the crisis of the state. Unlike the immediate post-World War I period, when, as we have seen, the death of the state was attributed to external factors, and I'm quoting from the paper, in the 1930s, Gramsci puts emphasis on the crisis of authority of the traditional ruling classes, which is made even more serious by the incapacity of the subaltern classes of indicating a way out, no exit. In Pirandello, an exit in search of an author. In a note dated December 1930, Gramsci draws attention to the changing attitude of the European intellectuals before the rising mass society, and declares, and goes on to discuss this in extremely important dialogical and dialectical theory. The question here, I think, is Gramsci's verging away from Jacobism that draws its messianic spirit from its faith in revealed truth or historical truth, the pretext of suppressing with violence every opposition. This becomes an extremely important between the wars that I point out, and I pointed out yesterday, the way which language and violence come together under the rule of law, and particularly in the German interpretation of the hegemonic transformation of the liberal Weimar state into the fake state of the Hitler regime. And so if it refuses to adhere to any social contract, and so falls into the contradiction that is so typical of democratic regimes, and here I'm quoting from Gramsci, the contradiction between tired professions of faith that hail unlimited freedom and the practice of tyranny and brutal intolerance. So let me go to some points about this that I gloss in relationship to the whole paper. First of all, I want to point out to the notion that the German unitary state between the two revolutions happening at the same time as Gramsci is writing this. The German unitary state was built on two cultural revolutions and political revolutions. The Cultural Revolution and the empire-building expansion of global expansion of borders, land, empires, ecological practices, ethnocide of cultures at the margins, supranationalism as a universal, supranationalism, that replaces internationalism, and the integration of the capitalist system of profit into a state planning market system. That is, in a certain sense, the progressive nature or the reactionary nature of the German state. However, the universalism that is implied in Gramsci's new cosmopolitanism, maybe one could say, incorporates the idea that provinces, especially in Italy, and I want to say a word about that, and distant lands are needed for the expansion of agriculture, mining, resources, and markets. Okay, this is how the new expansionism of global hegemony would look like in terms of what the political realities on the ground. So my question then is, posing this question of the German unitary state as a model for Europe, and one could also pose this in terms of its Leninist variant, has to do with I think Gramsci raises trenchantly the question of civil society and the question of equality and distribution of goods and distribution of wealth. Now, does that imply a different kind of market system? Now, one of the questions in the contemporary sense, how does this relate to populism today? And that's a question that I want to pose for us here and back to Professor Vacca. The slippery slope of populism and how does one define it? In addition to that, what was important in Gramsci's, in the emphasis that Professor Vacca made in Gramsci's crisis of the state, is the rise of political parties. The rise of political parties. So the question I have then in terms of the rise of parties and international socialism, for example, where does that put populism today in terms of the bifurcated nature of political parties? Contemporary Italian populism, for example, arrives with the arrival of the regionalist leagues in the late 1980s, in particular Veneto, Lombardy, and Piedmont, and leading to the formation of the Northern League. So how do we look at the Northern Liga in relationship to this crisis of the state? My second point, that was my first point. My second point is the crisis of the state also implies a crisis of culture, which is what I think Peter, in terms of language, is what I tried to refer to yesterday. The crisis of the spiritual nature, the Geist of, in the Hegelian sense, the Geist of the culture. So the crisis of the state in Italy and in Germany, and certainly in Russia, Soviet Union, creates new antagonisms. The fear of culture and intellectuals, because they represent external or independent knowledge, cosmopolitanism, with a different history, and other forms of collective imaginaries, with their modern art forms, futurism, for example, which Gramsci was aware of, or the depiction of alternate realities as part of the problem associated with state building, as no one escapes the notion of material needs over ideas. Okay. So this is a problem that comes up not only with the fracturing of the hegemonic state into a new party state and multiple political parties, which is what we are witnessing today in Europe, and also the antagonism to political parties that we're witnessing in the South, in the United States. Number 4, if you're keeping track. What we find in the hegemonic nations between the wars, and I'm referring to the transitional crisis of the state between the wars, which is the subject of your wonderful, carefully analyzed, was the making in the historical project of a paranoid military male spirit who now becomes the symbol to defend and extend the intrapsychic dialogue between the sexes into all institutions, youth and old age, women and men, child and female. Male and female identifications, parent-child, this is the realm of culture that I'm talking about. Parent-child identifications, and any longing for separation from authority is made into the criminalization of desires. That is to say, the violence and punitive nature of the Nazi one-party hegemonic state, right? So in other words, the question of identity is on the agenda for autocratic authoritarian states. The question of identity becomes a supra-hegemonic force under consumer capitalism, when the institution of the economic becomes both dominant and subsidiary to other passive revolutions in culture. We see that happening in the Trump world, the malignant narcissism of the Trump world that pretends in its populist, its attraction to populist movements, pretends to avoid culture, meanwhile banging the drum of culture and ethnicity and borders whenever it can. This was happening also in the period between and during the wars, as no other period before then. The migration, and here's a point I want to make that Gramsci is certainly aware of in prison, but it's not articulated, I think, enough. The migration, exodus, forced labor, which led in the last 2 years of World War II, had already begun after World War I, or during World War I. Michael Maroos, the Canadian historian, for example, has pointed out that there were as many as 30 million refugees in Europe 2 years before the end of the war, which began before the war. At the end of World War, there were 7 million souls lived extraterritorially. So the question of the crisis of the state between the wars and after the war was, as it is now, in Italy, Spain, Germany, Austria, France, where else? Not Russia, not Hungary, right, where the crisis of the state builds walls, okay? So what I'm pointing to here is the crisis of the state is the crisis of the public sphere. And here one might want to, those of you who are more adept at Habermas than I am, and I'm talking then with the construction, in a Gramscian hegemonic sense, the war of movement and the war of position which is, this is my last point, which is critical in understanding oppositional movements in Germany and Italy that are outside of the political parties. So where are the oppositional movements in the hegemony of the formation of the crisis of state? Where do they go? Where do they go? So how does the war of attrition, in Gramsci's sense, deal with the question of the opposition that is not part of the party, the many parties that are functioning in the crisis of the state? In the 1930s, the war of attrition meant the creation of a fascist public sphere. And I know that's a contradiction in terms. You talk about a public sphere and a fascist public sphere. But it was a simulated public sphere. That is to say, under the lawful watch of the Constitution, which Hans Neumann has talked about in Behemoth, which other theorists of law. It was a perfectly, in a sense, legal representation of violence in the crisis of the state, in the Nazi party. So what we're finding then is the Nazi state, the crisis of the state, rearranged the idea of the public against, as Marx and others said, all palpable evidence of the actuality of the degeneration of the public. In other words, the conflicting publics in the crisis of the state were identified in certain political parties. Everything the Nazi crisis of the state did was embedded in law, and the nation became the publicum, and emergency measures were taken to ensure that the borders and inwardness of the Kantian notion of the obligation to autonomy was not made public, but was enhanced in the sovereignty of the law. Fascism became a form of corporate, military, bureaucratic capitalism that needed labor. Fascism was a labor state. NSDAP, as you know, is the labor state. The public, however, conflicted publics, is embedded in the idea of reality as ideology, and the idea of ideology itself as a form of life. Speaking psychoanalytically, if one can, this is a fantasy. It's a restitution, destruction fantasy that sublimates estrangement, alienation into a non-objective form of being. I'm sorry to use such abstractions, but the domain of consent, the hegemony of consent under the crisis of the state, performed itself through a war of attrition of the public. The war of attrition was on the shoulders and the burden of the public. So we have to ask ourselves in Gramsci's terms and in other terms, as Alessandra pointed out to me in her reading of the paper, who is the subject of Gramsci's rethinking of cosmopolitanism with an ethical intent? That's the Kantian way of thinking of it. A new era of cosmopolitanism with a ethical political intent. Thank you.
I thank Jeremy very much because in a Gramscian sense, your comment made more complicated, complex. It's a development, your intervention is a development of a complexity. So it's quite impossible to simplify. Anyway, I tried to give some, not answers, some comment on the comment. Not on every subject. First of all, referring to Italy, the startup of Lega Nord coincided with the collapse of a party system.
The party system?
Yes. This is a peculiar of Italy in Europe during the last 30 years. And it must be stressed because Lega Nord is not a populist party. Until 2 years ago, was a partial, territorial, political syndicate. Well, typically economico-corporativo, territorial, anti-national, so nothing of populism. And during the last period of the so-called Second Republic, the last 25 years, the Lega Nord is at the moment the oldest party and the unique party effectively organized and with a leadership and the diffused cadres, organic in Gramscian sense. So this is Lega Nord in this situation of Italy, stressing the problem that the permanent crisis of party system that has never been not only resolved, but it's never been fronted, touched, actually. Confronted, yes. Second question. In Gramscian terms, I should not say that at a world scale, starting from the early 70s, we have had a new hegemony. We have had a continuous crisis of possibility of hegemony. because hegemony presumes war of position, that presupposes stabilization, stability. We are in a process of accelerating war of maneuver, with some periodization during the last 40 years. I should say the first 20 years, world economic conflict, and then monetary war, what usually is called globalization after 89. No, well, it's enough. It's not sufficient to say globalization is generico. And after the crisis of the 10 years ago, a new period of what is prevailing are forces that have the aim of deconstruction of politics, of political, with an idea of mercatizing that is against the politics. It's not equilibrium between, like, for instance, the glorious 30, globalization, hegemony of the states with the consensus of Soviet Union, equilibrium between world market and national market regulated with mixed economy and so on. No. Going on, we see that the tendency that prevails is deconstruct sovereignty, and deconstruct the previous forms of politics. So there is no hegemony because there are not the possibility of hegemony. There is a crisis of hegemony. With an increasing of commercial wars that usually increasing prepare global wars. And I am afraid that we are against confronting with this possibility. The crisis of the state is a crisis of public sphere. In a certain sense, I agree with you. But it concerns only mainly Europe, and maybe not only Europe, I mean Western, well, what we say Europe. Because it's a crisis of democracy. Because, well, democracy and the public sphere are deeply interconnected. But the reason, but maybe that in the afternoon we can discuss specifically this problem, are connected with the development, the cultural development of post-Second World War democracy that has had a fundamentum progressively economicistic, producing a kind of individual that, well, is legitimate to be individual sovereign, but is completely aware from the possibility to intend what it means, which are the responsibilities of popular sovereignty exercised individually. And this is a very gap of Western culture, is maybe the most acute sign of the crisis of Western culture, of our civilization. That's it, I think. Because, in the first decade after the Second World War, the richness of parties and the intermediate organization of civil society could, contain the push to economicistic individualism. What we see today, the only idea very spread in Western countries that I know are the right. I desire, and it means I have a right to do. And politics is for me only the possibility, instrumental, to pursue this idea. This is the crisis, but from my point of view, is the end of democracy. Because if I go, as I had the opportunity to stay in China in May, differently with the time when a Western European could go to the Soviet Union and perceive the need, the desire of Western democracy, values. I think that for the growing and the development of that kind of mix of civilization, power, and global projections, there is any interest to our civilization and democracy. They keep and use what they need, but don't feel the necessity to have a paragone, a comparison with them. And so, and if I had to speak more, I shall add that we are living a split inside the Western, and the impossibility to speak in a univoc sense of Western. The center of the conflict is in the Western, and is between the States and Europe. The more acute, not from military point of view. My opinion is that if we had produced a new money that can compete with dollar as a reserve money, we have created a duel without any answer on how unite this duel. At this point, the discussion would be much more long and complicated. I am afraid that my English is not sufficient to be clear. Thank you.